Tonight we return to a war not only fought on open battlefields, but in alleyways and attics, behind drawn curtains and false names. This is the story of Clara, a young woman whose footsteps never echoed in the history books, yet whose quiet defiance carried more weight than bullets. She was not a soldier. She was not trained. But she was dangerous in a way uniforms rarely were. A resistance fighter in occupied France. A courier with a quiet smile and forged papers. A ghost among the living, always moving, always watching, always at risk. Her story was never meant to be recorded, but she left behind pages, scattered, unfinished, sometimes stained with rain or ash, and always unsigned. And in them we find a voice, not loud but steady, a whisper of the fallen, still lingering. Clara's world existed underground, not just metaphorically, literally. The cellar beneath a bakery, the abandoned wine cave behind a crumbled vineyard wall, the tight crawl space under the floorboards of a dressmaker's shop. These were her stations, her foxholes, her trenches. She learned to sleep sitting upright, knees against her chest, to go hours without moving lest a creak give her away, to hold her breath when boots passed above. I learned to stop coughing, one torn scrap reed. I learned to let the walls breathe for me. The cold was constant, the dampness unforgiving. The flickering candlelight often ran out before hope did. There was no time for comfort, no place for fear, only discipline and silence. She folded messages into the seams of her jacket. She memorized drop points with the precision of a mathematician. She trained her ears to distinguish between the steps of a friend and the enemy. When the bombs fell elsewhere, her shelter didn't shake. It listened. The war for Clara wasn't about sweeping charges or heroic speeches. It was about waiting and choosing exactly when to move. Sometimes the bravest thing, she scribbled on the back of a ration slip, is not lighting the match, not opening the door, not speaking the truth. And yet she moved through this world with a strange calm, because even beneath the fear she had purpose. She was part of something larger, a single thread in a hidden tapestry, one that might never be seen, but held everything together. He was never named in her journals, just the man with the hollow eyes. He arrived one autumn evening at a resistance safe house, his coat too thin for the wind, his satchel too full for comfort. Clara was told he was important, a defector, a former translator for the Germans, now working to pass on intercepted documents. She was tasked with guiding him to the next town. They didn't speak much, but Clara remembered his eyes, dark, distant, like he had seen too much and understood too little of it. He blinked like each movement hurt, she wrote, as though memory had burned itself into the backs of his eyelids. They moved at night. She led, he followed, through forests thick with fog, and past farmhouses where shutters twitched like nervous thoughts. He barely looked up. He didn't ask where they were headed. He just muttered sometimes in his sleep. Names, orders, half-finished apologies. Clara began to understand that he had not changed sides because of morality. He had changed because there was nothing left inside him that could withstand another lie. She watched him struggle to eat, to write, to speak without flinching at his own voice. He was not broken, Clara wrote. He was unfinished, as though the war had carved away everything except the shell. On the third night, when the barn they were resting in was lit suddenly by searchlights in the distance, he stood, frozen, breathing hard. Clara took his hand. She didn't speak. She simply held it, firm, warm, real. And in that moment, the man with the hollow eyes returned, just for a breath, to being human. He made it to the next contact point. She never saw him again, but she remembered that hand in hers. Not because it was heroic, but because it was trembling. And still he held on. The smell always gave it away. Burned paper, that bitter, papery smoke that never quite faded, even after the ashes had been swept and the windows flung open. It clung to her coat, her hair, her hands, to the pages of her journal, even when she kept them sealed in cloth. "You don't just destroy the paper," Clara once wrote. "You carry the burning with you." Every few days she was handed a document, sometimes a note, sometimes a list of names, sometimes photographs, black and white and haunting. She didn't always read them. She didn't want to know who she was protecting or betraying, only what to deliver and when. But sometimes she had to burn them when checkpoints shifted or patrols grew too close, when she saw a neighbor watching too long from their window. In those moments there was no time for regret, only for fire. She learned to light matches even when her fingers shook, to breathe through her nose when the smoke stung her eyes, to feel the heat without flinching. "I've burned things I'll never get back," she wrote, "but I think the worst part is wondering who those ashes once were." One day she was given a letter to carry, sealed in red wax, hurriedly handed to her in a cafe. But before she reached the alley behind the station, she saw the soldiers, 3 of them, too close, too alert. She ducked into a butcher's shop, excused herself politely, and slipped into the storeroom. There, behind crates of salted meat and curing hooks, she struck the match. The letter flared, curled in on itself. The wax hissed and melted. Words became smoke. The soldiers passed. They never saw her. But that night, when she sat alone in the dark, she found her hands still smelled like fire. "The war taught me that sometimes survival means becoming the thing that disappears first," she noted in the margin. Like smoke, like words unspoken. Clara's mother had taught her to stitch long before the war. Needle and thread, fabric pulled taut in an embroidery hoop. Flowers, birds, names in looping cursive. Domestic beauty woven slowly by hand. When the war came, Clara kept sewing, but the patterns changed. She stitched nothing decorative. Instead, she threaded messages. Numbers hidden in vine curls, dates in the wings of butterflies, coordinates disguised as petals. "I stitched resistance into cotton," she wrote, "and prayed no one ever noticed how perfect the flowers were." Each piece became a silent transmission. Cloth napkins passed hand to hand, handkerchiefs folded with a nod, scarf edges tugged just once in parting. To the untrained eye they were tokens, gifts, loveliness in hard times, but to the network they were firepower. Information that couldn't be intercepted over the radio, that couldn't be cracked by code breakers, that lived only in the mind of the maker and the eyes of the reader. Once she embroidered an entire train schedule into the hem of a child's apron. Another time, the name of a collaborator was hidden in the stem of a daisy, stitched into a wedding handkerchief. She delivered it with a smile. The man never saw it coming. But the danger was constant. One wrong thread, one slip, one glance too long by a curious guard, and the whole illusion would unravel. Clara didn't just stitch fabric, she stitched lies. Beautiful, believable, brilliant lies. Sometimes I miss sewing for peace, she reflected, but now I think perhaps every stitch was always a kind of prayer. A prayer not for beauty, but for survival, for justice, for the truth to endure, even if disguised in roses and vines. There was a village tucked between two hills and half forgotten by the front lines. It had a clock tower that always ran 10 minutes slow, and shutters painted the same fading green on every window. Clara arrived just after dawn under the pretense of visiting an aunt who didn't exist. Her mission was simple: deliver a coded message to the schoolmaster and move on. But for a brief, flickering moment, she considered staying. The village was quiet in a way Clara had almost forgotten existed. The baker handed her a warm roll without charge. Children played marbles in the dust without fear. Even the air smelled like lavender and old wood. There was something terrible about how peaceful it was, she wrote, as though the war had politely forgotten this place. She sat on a bench near the square, watched an old man feed pigeons, saw a woman hang sheets in the sun, humming to herself, not out of defiance, but contentment. And for the first time in months, Clara didn't feel like a ghost. She felt present, real. The schoolmaster received the message with a slight nod. No words exchanged, a slip of linen passed discreetly. It was over in seconds. She could have left right then. But she stayed one more night. She rented a room above a cobbler's shop. She watched the sky turn red behind the hills. She let herself breathe. She even let herself smile. It wasn't love, she clarified later. It was longing, for stillness, for something soft, for a place where no one needed me to disappear. But by morning she was gone, because the war hadn't forgotten her. Because peace for people like Clara was not a home, it was a hiding place, and she could not afford to hide for long. There was an attic room in an old townhouse in Lyon, used by the resistance as a listening post. Clara had spent 3 nights there, surrounded by crates of paper, cables, and radios cobbled together from mismatched parts. But what stayed with her most wasn't the rusted antenna or the way the floorboards groaned under her step. It was the mirror, tall, cracked near the corner, tucked behind a wooden beam, as though someone had once tried to forget it was there. It reflected more than light. Every morning before I left, I looked into that mirror, she wrote, to make sure I still looked like her, the girl they needed, the woman I was pretending to be. Clara had many names, forged papers, temporary identities, borrowed smiles. But each time she faced that mirror, the mask felt thinner, her hair tucked beneath a scarf, a freckle darkened with cold pencil to match a false passport photo. The way she stood slightly straighter, chin tilted up, the posture of someone who belonged. Only she didn't. She belonged to no name, no place, only the cause. The mirror didn't care. It simply showed her as she was. The tired eyes, the faded bruise on her shoulder, the corner of her mouth she could no longer convince to smile naturally. I was afraid, she admitted, that one day the mirror would show nothing at all, that I would vanish, not from death, but from forgetting myself entirely. One night, during a blackout, she lit a single candle and stood before the mirror longer than usual. She whispered her real name, once, softly, just to remember the sound of it. Then she blew out the flame and disappeared again. There was a house in Reims where Clara once hid for 2 days behind a false wall beneath the staircase. The family living there was known only by initials. The father worked with the railway, the mother baked bread in silence, and the little boy, no more than 5, would leave her crusts of toast when he thought no one was looking. Behind that wall there was no room to stand. No light, only the smell of old wood, a trickle of dust, and a sliver of air that tasted like forgotten time. She wasn't the first to hide there. You could tell by the scratched messages etched into the plaster, tiny names, dates. One just read, still here, still quiet, still hoping. She added her own mark, a small stitched symbol, worked into the lining of the coat she folded behind her head as a pillow, waiting, breathing shallowly, counting the footsteps above, neighbors, Gestapo, maybe no one at all. Time stretched like thread pulled too tight. Each hour another loop in the same thought. Will they knock? Will I run? Or will I be found, silent and still, beneath these stairs? But no one came. When the contact finally tapped twice on the stair rail, the code for safe, Clara blinked in the sudden light and crawled out slowly, her limbs tingling with return. The little boy was waiting. He held a crust in his hand. He didn't speak. He just placed it in hers. And there is a kind of whisper, she wrote, that doesn't need to be spoken. A whisper that passes from hand to hand, like a piece of bread, or a name softly remembered. Even now, years after the walls have been torn down and the house rebuilt, someone may walk the stairs and pause, not knowing why. Just a whisper beneath the boards. It was supposed to be a routine handoff. A folded note, sealed in wax, slipped into Clara's gloved hand beneath the canopy of a morning market. She was to walk 12 blocks, cross the canal, and leave it in a hollow brick at the base of a chapel wall. She had done it before. She could have done it blindfolded. But that morning something changed. There was a checkpoint that hadn't been there the day before. 2 soldiers, casual, chatting, but watching. She took a different route, doubled back, waited in a cafe until the church bells rang once, then twice. But by then, someone was already following her. She could feel it, that pull behind the spine, the too silent street, the shadow that paused when she paused. There would be no delivery, no safe house, just choices. Sometimes the bravest thing, she wrote, is to choose not to do what you were asked. She crossed into a neighborhood filled with ash-colored buildings and alleys she didn't know. She took the message from her pocket and stood by a canal bridge, and she waited for footsteps to draw near, for uniforms to turn the corner, for eyes to meet hers. Instead, an old woman with a market basket passed. A cat, a boy on a bicycle, no one else, and still she couldn't be sure. She tore the note into 3 pieces, dropped them in the canal, watching as the words bled and blurred into water. The mission was gone. But she wasn't. That night she didn't write about failure. She wrote about instinct, about listening to the voice that comes not from orders or training, but survival. We are told to be useful, she wrote, but sometimes being alive is the greatest usefulness of all. She never learned what the message said. She never knew if it mattered. But years later she still dreamed of that canal, still heard the sound of soaked paper breaking apart beneath her fingertips. And she never stopped wondering if, in that moment, she had saved a life or lost one. Names were never supposed to matter. In the resistance, names were dangerous, a luxury Clara was trained to avoid. She was taught to remember faces, voices, hands, not names, never names. But there was one she couldn't forget, Emile, a fellow courier, tall, with the posture of someone always on the verge of running or laughing. He had a way of folding maps like they were paper birds, and a smile that seemed unaware of the war. They met only 3 times, once at a railway station pretending to be strangers on a bench, once in a barn loft watching parachutes blossom like dandelions above the fields, and once, the last time, in a candlelit kitchen, their knees nearly touching beneath the table, though they said nothing of it. I don't know if I loved him, Clara wrote, but I remembered his name, even when I forgot my own. Emile whistled when he walked, a habit too bold, too cheerful. She warned him, he winked, he disappeared a week later. Word spread quickly through the network, picked up at a checkpoint. No chance to burn his papers, no trial, no return. And Clara, for all her practiced detachment, found herself saying his name aloud one night in an empty room, just once. Emile, like a spell, like a confession, like an apology. She wrote the name in her journal, then struck it out, then wrote it again. Some names stay even when you try to let them go, she later added. They bloom inside you like wildflowers, not planted, not wanted, but bright. Years later, she couldn't recall what she was carrying the day they last met, but she remembered the way he handed her a pen just to fix a smudge on her hand, the way he whistled, even in silence, and most of all, the way she never stopped hearing his name when the wind pushed through shuttered alleys, or when she woke from dreams where no one was left but her. France had many winters during the war, but Clara would later say the cold that haunted her most was not the one from snow or sleet. It was a different kind of cold, the kind that settled beneath your skin, regardless of the season, the kind you carried with you, even when the sun returned. It began, perhaps, in a church basement, one with stone walls slick with condensation, where she'd hidden for 2 nights with a wounded radio operator. The room was dark. The only warmth came from the shallow breath of the man who muttered Morse code in his sleep. He died sometime after midnight. No scream, no gasp, just silence where there had been a second heartbeat. It was the first time I felt cold inside my chest, she wrote, as though something had blown out a candle in my lungs. That cold lingered. not in her bones, but in her decisions. She found herself hesitating longer, feeling the weight of her footsteps, thinking too much before every mission. It didn't feel like fear, it felt like numbness. She began carrying a matchbook in her pocket, not for messages or sabotage, but just to watch the tiny flames when she was alone. A flicker, a pause, a reminder of warmth. She never struck more than one at a time. Sometimes the cold came in the faces of others, the look of a mother saying goodbye too quickly, the eyes of a man who had stopped hoping. And sometimes it came in her own reflection, in the way her smile wouldn't quite rise, in the way she folded letters more slowly than before. "We were never supposed to be frozen," she wrote, "but the cold, once it finds you, changes how you move, how you speak, how you choose to survive." It wasn't something she could explain. It wasn't about temperature. It was the chill of becoming the kind of person who keeps going, even when something inside has stopped. There was a narrow street in the Ninth Arrondissement, no more than a crooked alley, lined with shuttered windows and cobblestones, so uneven they whispered underfoot. Clara called it Rue Silent-Sus, the Silent Street. It wasn't on any of her maps. No official record. No postal address. But everyone in her network knew it well. It was a meeting place, a crossing, a breath between danger and escape. She walked that street dozens of times, but never the same way. Sometimes from the north, with her scarf drawn up. Sometimes from the west, arms full of laundry or vegetables, hiding a folded message in her sleeve. But every time, every single time, it was silent. Not just quiet, unnaturally silent. No birds, no shouting children, no vendors. Just air and tension and footsteps that always seemed too loud. It felt, she wrote, like the war paused for that one block, as if the world knew not to breathe there. One evening she met a contact there, a woman in a burgundy coat. They exchanged no words, just a glance, a touch of hands. But as Clara turned to leave, she realized something. She hadn't heard a single sound since entering the alley. No wind, no breath, not even her heart beat. It was as though silence had weight, and the street carried it all. Later that night, she wrote the experience down, not as an observation, but as a confession. "I think the silence protected us," she mused, or maybe it was mourning something we couldn't name. Years later, long after the war, Clara returned to that arrondissement. The alley was still there, but different. Gentrified, cleaned. Children now played in its corners. Cafes had spilled into its cobbled curves. Noise had returned. But as she passed through, she swore she felt it. Just for a second, that hush, that breathless space between now and never again. The bitter chill of dawn crept silently across the ruins of the village. Clara sat alone by the smoldering embers of a once roaring fire, the smoke curling faintly into the gray sky. Her breath came out in shallow clouds, mingling with the cold morning air. She pulled her threadbare coat tighter, the fabric worn thin from months of constant use and hardship. Before her lay the worn pages of her journal, edges frayed, ink blurred by rain and sweat. Each page was a fragile thread in the tapestry of memory, sketches of broken homes, shattered weapons, and faces etched with pain and courage. The journal was her anchor, the only place where the chaos of war could be made sense of, where the living and the dead could meet in silent communion. She turned to a fresh page, her pen hovering uncertainly. The memory of Kitso came unbidden, the young messenger whose smile had been bright even in the darkest times. His last message, scribbled hastily and stained with dirt and blood, had spoken of a bold plan to cut the enemy's supply lines. He had vanished during the mission, swallowed by the unforgiving forest. His absence was a wound that refused to heal. Clara's fingers traced the faded ink. She whispered softly, "Kitso, your courage lives here." Her voice was barely audible, yet it carried the weight of all their hopes. The war was more than strategic maneuvers and gunfire. It was a relentless tide of loss. Each fallen comrade left a shadow that stretched long and cold, threatening to overwhelm the fragile flicker of hope. Clara felt those shadows pressing in, a constant reminder of the price they paid for freedom. Suddenly, a soft rustle from the nearby thicket pulled her attention. Neo, a fellow resistance fighter and trusted friend, emerged from the shadows. His face, marked by exhaustion and resolve, softened as he saw Clara. Without words, Neo settled beside her, his presence a quiet reassurance. Together, they shared a moment of silence, the kind that only those who have walked the edge of despair can understand. Breaking the silence, Neo pulled from his pack a small, crumpled photograph, a glimpse of life before the war, before the sacrifice. It was a reminder of what they fought for: family, home, and the fragile dream of peace. Their conversation turned to the fallen, to stories that no official history would ever tell. They spoke of Thebo, who had held the line with unwavering courage, of Neo's own brother, lost to a sudden ambush, and of countless others whose names would fade without the pages of their journals. In this shared remembering, Clara found strength. The shadows of loss were still there, but now they were joined by the light of memory and purpose. Each story told was a promise that the sacrifices would not be forgotten, that even in the darkest hours humanity endured. Clara closed her journal gently and looked toward the horizon, where the first pale rays of sun began to pierce the gloom. The war was far from over, but for a moment hope felt real again. The village lay in silence beneath a heavy, brooding sky. Clara and Neo moved cautiously through the shattered streets, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust and debris. The ruins spoke in whispers, echoes of laughter, cries, and footsteps long vanished, trapped forever in broken walls and collapsed roofs. Clara's journal was tucked safely inside her coat, a constant companion, amid the uncertainty. She paused before what remained of a small schoolhouse, the blackened walls scarred by fire. Inside, faint scraps of paper fluttered on the breeze, caught between splintered desks and broken windows. She knelt, carefully retrieving a torn page from the wreckage. The faded handwriting was barely legible, but the words carried a haunting innocence. Today we learned about the stars. I want to see them again, far away from the noise and smoke. A pang tightened Clara's chest. The children who once filled this place with hope were gone, swallowed by the war's relentless hunger. She closed her eyes and let the memories settle, the laughter of children playing beneath clear skies, untouched by conflict. Neo placed a hand on her shoulder. "We carry their stories now," he said softly. "Their dreams, their fears, it's our burden and our strength." Together they pressed forward, moving like shadows through the ruins. Every step was a testament to endurance, every breath a defiance against despair. As they reached the edge of the village, Clara opened her journal once more, scribbling a few hurried lines. The past clings to these stones, silent witnesses to lives cut short. But as long as we remember, they live on. We fight for the stars, for light beyond the darkness. The sky began to lighten, the promise of dawn breaking through the clouds. For Clara and Neo, each new day was a fragile victory, a chance to honor the fallen by continuing the fight. Night descended swiftly, wrapping the camp in a cloak of uneasy silence. Clara lay awake beneath a thin blanket, the distant sounds of gunfire like thunder rolling across the valley. Shadows danced on the tent walls, twisting with every flicker of the dying fire. Her thoughts wandered to the letters she had kept hidden, fragments of words from those who had fallen, their voices carried across time by fragile paper. Each letter was a thread connecting past to present, a reminder that even in death, the fallen spoke to those left behind. Clara's fingers brushed over one such letter from Thabo, a childhood friend turned soldier. "If this reaches you, know that I fought with everything I had. The world may forget us, but my heart will always beat alongside yours." She folded the letter carefully and pressed it to her chest, a silent prayer for strength. The war was not just battles and strategies. It was a mosaic of human stories, pain, and hope intertwined. Outside, Neo kept watch, his silhouette a steady sentinel against the darkness. In that moment, Clara understood that their fight was as much about preserving these memories as it was about survival. The night held its breath, and somewhere beneath the endless stars the echoes of the fallen whispered on the wind. The early light filtered through the dense canopy as Clara and Neo gathered with their small group in a hidden clearing, faces marked by exhaustion, yet burning with quiet determination, surrounded her. Each one a story of sacrifice and resilience. Around the flickering campfire, stories were shared, tales of narrow escapes, of lost friends, and fleeting moments of peace in the chaos of war. The bonds between them were forged not just by the fight, but by the shared understanding of what had been lost. Clara looked around at the faces lit by dawn's glow, feeling the weight of responsibility settle deeper. These were her family now, the threads that held her tethered to hope. She reached into her pack and pulled out her journal, reading aloud a passage written days before. "In the fire of conflict, we find strength not just in weapons, but in each other. Our scars tell stories, stories that refuse to fade." A murmur of agreement passed through the group. Neo nodded solemnly, adding, "Every name, every memory, it's fuel for the fight ahead." The clearing was quiet but alive, a fragile sanctuary in a world torn apart. For Clara, these moments of connection were as vital as any victory on the battlefield. Together, they prepared to move forward, carrying with them the unbreakable bond of shared sacrifice. By midday, the group had moved deeper into the forest, following old game trails and forgotten footpaths, careful to avoid the main roads now crawling with enemy patrols. Clara walked near the front, her eyes scanning for familiar landmarks, a twisted tree, a sun-bleached rock, fragments of memory from before the occupation. They arrived at the skeletal remains of a farmhouse, long reduced to rubble. Ivy and wild grass had crept over the scorched walls, softening the scars of war. Beneath the debris, Clara and Neo dug carefully, not for food, not for weapons, but for a memory left behind. It was Neo who found it, a rusted metal box half buried beneath fallen beams. Inside was a folded cloth map, hand-drawn and faded, its edges brittle. Clara's breath caught. She recognized it immediately. It was one of the old resistance maps, charting out known routes, hidden caches, and safe havens now lost to time. She unrolled it gently. Ink smudges marked supply trails. Red circles highlighted former rendezvous points, some now behind enemy lines, others erased completely. But one mark remained untouched, a small triangle deep in the forest with a handwritten note beside it. If all else fails here, Neo leaned in, his brow furrowed. That's near the stone quarry. We haven't been there in months. Could be risky. Or it could be shelter, Clara replied. Or supplies, or survivors. A decision hung in the air. The group was low on food and morale. Every step further from the enemy's gaze was a step closer to safety or a trap. Clara took out her journal and noted the map's details, adding her own observations beside the fading ink. Whatever they chose, the journal would remember. It always did. They moved out before sunset, heading toward the old quarry, chasing a mark left by someone who had once hoped they might make it this far. It wasn't just navigation. It was belief. The forest grew denser as Clara and her group moved closer to the quarry. The air was thick with damp earth and pine, muffling their footsteps. Birds had fallen silent, and even the wind held its breath, as if nature itself knew the place ahead had once been sacred and now stood haunted. By nightfall, they reached the ridge overlooking the quarry, a gaping wound in the earth, long abandoned by miners and now swallowed by silence. Cranes stood frozen like skeletons, and rusted carts lay overturned on shattered tracks. The place reeked of absence, yet something lingered, the faint suggestion that it had not been completely forgotten. Clara scanned the area through broken binoculars and then pointed toward a narrow opening at the base of the quarry wall. Hidden beneath moss and stone was a slanted metal door, partially concealed. It matched the mark on the map. Neo approached cautiously. With the help of another fighter, he cleared away debris and forced the door open. A wave of stale air escaped, dry, cold, untouched. Inside was a shallow bunker carved directly into the rock, likely dug during the early days of the Resistance. They stepped into the darkness, lighting a single oil lantern. Crates of old supplies lined the far wall, some spoiled, some still sealed. Medical kits, rations, a few rusted rifles wrapped in oilcloth. But it wasn't the supplies that silenced them. It was the wall covered in writing. Dozens of names, etched by hand. Fighters, messengers, civilians. Beneath each name, brief messages. Made it through the winter, heading south. 3 of us left, morale low. We'll hold as long as we can. If you're reading this, you're not alone. Clara stood frozen, lantern trembling slightly in her hand. It was a sanctuary, but also a memorial, a place of last hopes. She found a clear space on the wall and pulled out a piece of charcoal. Carefully, she wrote, Clara, Neo, and 7 others. June 1943. Still fighting, still remembering. Then, beneath it in smaller writing, you are not alone. For the first time in weeks, the group rested without fear. The quarry, a scar in the earth, had become a cradle of memory. And in that stillness, surrounded by the ghosts of those who had come before, Clara realized something profound. They were part of a much larger story, a story of defiance, of resilience, and of the unbreakable human spirit. Morning arrived slowly at the quarry bunker, seeping in through cracks in the metal door like hesitant hope. For the first time in weeks, Clara awoke not to gunfire or shouting, but to the quiet breathing of her comrades, a sound as gentle and precious as birdsong. Neo was already awake, crouched near the old stove in the corner, trying to coax a flame from damp firewood. Clara joined him, and together they worked in silence until the fire finally caught, casting a dim orange glow across the stone walls. It felt human. A fire, a warm drink, a shared silence. These were not luxuries. They were acts of rebellion against the war that tried to strip them of their softness. As the others stirred, Clara stood and studied the wall of messages again. So many voices, so many final entries. And yet they had added their names, not as a farewell, but as a continuation. After breakfast, Neo gathered the group. We need to make a decision. We can stay here a day, maybe 2, but the longer we linger, the more dangerous it becomes. There are signs of enemy patrols nearby. Clara nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She had taken inventory of the supplies in the bunker. One of the crates contained something unexpected. A working radio unit tucked away beneath tarps and cloth. Old, but not broken. Its battery had miraculously retained a small charge. She spent hours cleaning its connectors and tuning the dials. And then, with a hesitant breath, she turned it on. Static. Humming. Then, a voice. Faint. Distant. Repeat. Southern corridor compromised. Resistance cells retreating to secondary post. If anyone hears this, respond. Clara's heart raced. A living voice. proof that they were not alone in the forest. She scribbled in her journal, "Today the radio spoke. We are not alone in the dark. Somewhere others are still fighting, still hoping. The fire has not gone out." That evening, the group gathered around the radio as Clara transmitted a reply. "This is Clara, Quarry Bunker Unit. 9 survivors. We hear you. We're still here." For the first time in months, they weren't just hiding. They were part of a movement again. The fire had been rekindled. Night fell with a kind of quiet anticipation. The radio crackled softly in the corner, its antenna angled toward the opening in the rock wall. Clara sat beside it, her journal resting on her knees, open to a blank page that waited like fresh snow. The response came just after midnight, a voice faint but steady. "Quarry Bunker Unit, this is South Ridge Command. Reinforcements are not possible, but we're coordinating escapes along Corridor 7. Rendezvous at the stone viaduct. You must move within 72 hours. Patrols have intensified." The room fell silent. Neo's brow tightened. Others exchanged uncertain glances. The stone viaduct was nearly 30 kilometers east, a stretch of land exposed and crawling with enemy activity. But it was a path, a thread, a chance. Clara stood and turned to face the group. "We've survived this long without help," she said quietly. "But this is something, a lifeline, a sign. If we make it to that viaduct, we join the others. We become more than a scattered flame in the forest. But if we try and fail..." One of the younger fighters, Mara, spoke hesitantly. Clara nodded. "We risk everything, like we always have. But this time we have a destination." She turned back to her journal and wrote, "In the heart of this quiet place, a voice reached us through the static. Not a command, not an order, a call, one that reminds us that war hasn't broken every line between us. We're still connected, still part of something bigger." Plans were made swiftly, maps drawn, watches rotated, ammunition checked, and by the glow of the small bunker lantern, Clara traced the route eastward with a blunt pencil, whispering names from the wall as a kind of blessing. "Thabo, Kipso, Annika, all of you walked so we could continue." Outside, the forest held its breath. The time to move was near. They departed before sunrise, slipping out of the quarry like ghosts. Packs tightened, weapons checked, boots muffled in damp moss. The forest greeted them not with birdsong, but with a deep, eerie quiet, the kind of silence that felt too heavy, too still. Clara led the way, the hand-drawn map folded tightly in her coat pocket. Neo flanked the rear, eyes scanning for movement. The others walked in pairs, their breaths shallow, every step deliberate. They kept to the old forest routes, trails carved long ago by fleeing resistance groups and forgotten by the enemy. Ferns brushed their legs. Branches whispered above like they were warning them to hurry. Midday brought a chilling discovery. In a narrow pass between 2 steep ridges, they stumbled upon the remains of another unit, 4 bodies half covered by pine needles, their insignia barely visible. Resistance fighters. Recent. Clara knelt beside them and found a slip of paper tucked into a coat. Ambushed. Couldn't reach the viaduct. Tell them we tried. She folded the note gently and placed it in her journal, hands trembling. Another reminder that this path was more than dangerous. It was soaked in sacrifice. They buried the fallen quickly and silently. No names were known, but they would not be left alone in the open. Clara wrote in her journal later that evening, hidden under the roots of an ancient tree, Even in death, they gave us direction, a warning, a message. They were trying to reach the same light we now chase. Their silence is not the end, it's part of the road. As night fell, the group huddled close. Neo kept his rifle across his lap. Mara rested her head on her knees, eyes open but distant. "We keep moving," Clara whispered to herself. "Not because we're sure, but because the ones who didn't make it would have wanted us to try." Above them the trees shifted softly, the canopy holding in their heat, their breath, their fear, and their will to go on. Dawn broke with a blood-orange sky, streaked with clouds that looked like torn fabric. The forest thinned, and the ancient stone viaduct rose in the distance, massive, weathered and lonely, stretching over a gorge carved by centuries of rain and wind. Clara stared at it from the tree line, her breath catching. It was real. After all the fear, silence, and loss, something still stood. A symbol, a place that hadn't crumbled beneath the weight of war. But the viaduct wasn't empty. Figures moved across its far end. Resistance or patrol? Neo crouched beside her, raising his binoculars. One of them just signaled, flashlight, twice short, once long. "That's the code. South Ridge Command." Relief washed over her in a silent wave, not joy, not triumph, but a quiet, aching kind of exhale. They were close, but the approach was still dangerous. Open ground, a winding path along a crumbling wall. One wrong move, and the forest would become a trap. Clara made the call. They split into two groups. Hers would lead, drawing attention if needed. Neo's would follow, covering the rear. If one group fell, the other might still reach the bridge. They began the final approach. Every footstep on gravel felt like a heartbeat, every gust of wind a warning. Halfway across, a shot rang out, distant, sharp. Clara didn't stop. She ran harder, the journal pressed to her chest, her eyes locked on the figure, waving them forward at the far end of the viaduct. More shots. Two of the younger fighters fell behind, but Neo grabbed them, dragging them forward. Dust flew. Stone cracked. Someone screamed, and then hands. Resistance fighters pulled them across. Shouts. First aid. Embraces, relief. They had made it. Not all unscathed, but alive. Clara sat on the ground beside the far pillar of the viaduct, the wind tugging at her coat. She opened her journal one final time for the day, and with a trembling hand wrote, "We crossed the line." Not between forest and road, but between isolation and connection, between memory and movement. We are not the end of the story. We are its continuation. We carry them with us in every step, every scar, every breath, and we will not forget. As the sun rose behind them, casting long shadows across the gorge, Clara looked back at the path they had come from, and silently she said thank you.